Olá, bom dia a todos e todas. Sejam bem-vindos ao nosso terceiro e último dia do Congresso da USFAL. Queria pedir a gentileza de vocês se assentarem do lado de cá da plateia, porque hoje vai ser uma videoconferência e a câmera pega exatamente esse lado. Obrigado pela compreensão. Um lembrete do livro, do e-book que a gente está organizando com os trabalhos escritos e apresentados aqui neste congresso. O prazo para o envio dos trabalhos completos é no dia 10 de novembro e todas as informações estão no nosso site www.iel.com.br/ausfal2023. Unicamp, esqueci do Unicamp. iel.unicamp.br/ausfal2023, perdão. Agora vamos dar início aos trabalhos dessa sexta-feira, começando com uma palestra por videoconferência. A palestrante de hoje é a professora doutora Annabelle Lukin, do Departamento de Linguística da Universidade Macquarie. Annabelle é professora associada de Linguística na Universidade em Sydney e pesquisa linguagem e ideologia, ideologias de guerra e violência, comunicação em saúde e discurso climático. Leciona teoria linguística geral e gramática sistêmico-funcional, baseada em Halliday. O tema da fala de Annabelle é Metodologia da Linguística Sistêmico-Funcional e Corpus, um caso de teste de direito internacional de guerra. A palestra será ministrada em inglês e por videoconferência, que vocês podem acompanhar pelo telão. Ao final da palestra, teremos um espaço e um tempo para perguntas e comentários que podem ser feitos diretamente a Annabelle. Boa palestra, Annabelle.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank Rodrigo again for the very generous invitation that he extended to me to present a workshop at this year's ALSFEL conference and also this keynote presentation. And when I received the message from him, he gave me an open floor and said I could design a workshop on whatever topic I was interested in and present on any aspect of my research. And I feel very honoured and privileged to have that invitation from Rodrigo. So as announced, the topic for my talk today is SFL and corpus methods, a test case from international war law. SFL, as you all know, is a very, very rich framework for the study of language. And in this paper, I'm extending it to combine with corpus methods and also giving an illustration of how it can be extended into a relatively new field for linguistics, which is the field of international law and in particular international war law. Before I begin, I want to do an acknowledgement of country. I'm not a First Nations person. In Australia, a First Nations person would welcome you to country, but I'm not a First Nations person, but I want to do an acknowledgement of country, which is to say that I work on Wallamadigal land and I live on the land of the Guringai people. And that's where I'm presenting to you today from where I live. This is my home office. I also want to acknowledge this country was never ceded, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any First Nations people present today. I would really, really love to be with you in Brazil, but we're in a climate emergency. I know that Brazil's been experiencing a heat wave in winter, and so I no longer fly for work, and I'm doing my best to decarbonise my life. So that's why I'm not with you in Brazil. So the outline of my paper today is to give you a feeling for the data of the case study that I've been working on really since 2018. And then I want to look at the kind of history of SFL and corpus linguistics, to look at the overlaps and the common origins. And then I want to get into the data and bring out some of the micro lexicogrammatical patterning as a way to, study what's going on in this body of law. And then I want to stand back from that and try and work out how we understand the kinds of patternings. How do they come together? Why do they come together? So that's the outline of the talk, and I look forward to some questions and discussion at the end. So when we talk about the laws of war or war law, we're talking about a set of international treaties, conventions, and a couple of other associated texts that really go in parallel with the rise of the International Committee of the Red Cross. So it's a body of laws that have been emerging and developing over a period of nearly 170 years. And the International Red Cross, part of its brief is to educate people about the laws of war, or what's also called international humanitarian law. One of the very interesting things about this body of law is people don't quite agree on how it should be described. So, as I say, very much connected with the history and the work and the mission of the International Committee of the Red Cross. I came to be studying this data because I previously worked on the media reporting of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and I became very, very interested in the lexical item war, which felt to me like it had a whole lot of legality and legitimacy that I couldn't quite properly understand. And so that's what led me to start to look at international war law. And so the Red Cross, as I say, part of its mission is to promote the laws of war or the rules of law. And so they have a kind of narrative about what these texts do. This is the first text in this corpus. So this is 1856, and it's the first example of an open multilateral international treaty. So it's the birth of a new register, which these days, of course, we're very familiar with the idea of an international treaty or an international convention, but the international community had to kind of develop this way of negotiating and interacting. And so we see the very first example of any international treaty is in the field of war, and it's the Paris Declaration of 1856. Nice and short. By the later part of the 20th century, of course, these documents are much more bureaucratic and much, much longer than these initial documents. So that is taken to be the first treaty in the field of international war law. But in fact, the origins of international war law go back before 1856. It sort of depends how far back you want to go, but certainly the first kind of scholarly thinking about the nature of international law happens around the age of imperialism, and in particular Spanish imperialism. And so some of the very early thinkers about the limits of imperial power are Spanish theologians, and a prominent event that sparked some of this thinking was the Battle of Cajamarca in Peru, which was a bloody and vicious, massacre. You can see on my Wikipedia slide, there's debate about how to label this act of violence. Is it a battle or is it a massacre? And so the news of this event made its way back to Spain. And so some of the earliest documents that start to think about these issues derive from the violent excesses of the Spanish Empire. So Francisco de Vitoria is an example of one of these early thinkers in the field of international law. And, you know, he quite radically argued that there were limits on the power of the Spanish emperor, that Spain could not just do whatever it liked in the process of its conquest of the Americas. So this is a set of texts, as I say, that go over a period of about 170 years. It's got very strongly European origins in its history. In 2010, an international convention for the protection of all persons from enforced disappearance was adopted. And of course, this is a convention that very much came out of the kinds of conflicts in the 70s and 80s in Latin America. And it wasn't ratified till 2010. You can see how long these processes of international agreement take. And another one of these instruments that's also been relevant to the kind of conflicts and violence in Latin America is an additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions. So, of course, the Geneva Conventions of 1949 are perhaps the most famous international treaties around war law, and in 1977, two more protocols are promulgated, and one in particular is about the protection of victims of non-international armed conflicts. And so some of the conflicts in Latin America have been legally interpreted through the second additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions. So as part of working on this field, I harvested all of these texts from the International Committee of the Red Cross website and collaborated actually with a Brazilian colleague, Rodrigo Araujo Castro, who was a PhD student at Macquarie, and he did some work to help me get this data into a format so that it could be set up as a corpus that was available and accessible. And this was a paper that we published last year that's all the details about how we put this corpus together. So the corpus consists of 110 documents over this period from 1856 up to 2019. And you can access it through the Sydney Corpus Lab, through a CQP web data interface. That's what you're looking at. So it's set up for you to search if you're interested to work with this data. And it's also completely downloadable from this site to be processed in some of the other corpus linguistics tools. Now, there's so much interesting work going on in critical legal studies that's looking at this data and trying to understand what work these texts do. The narrative about where these texts come from and what effects they have is very, very much contested. So for the International Committee of the Red Cross, they talk about the evolution of the laws of war as if it has been a step towards greater and greater prohibition and limits of the violence in war. But many scholars dispute this narrative about these texts from a variety of perspectives. And I've just popped the abstract there from a paper called The Laws of War and the Structure of Masculine Power. So there are various scholars looking at these laws from a feminist point of view. And this paper, for instance, argues that the rules of war, among other things, are about the construction of a kind of plausible and modern masculinity. So that these laws try to project an idea of the use of strength and force and power, but with limits and restraint that show the kind of, a particular kind of masculinity that's powerful and yet restrained, can keep itself in check. So just so much interesting work in this field. And so I've come in from a linguistics point of view. There's really not very much linguistic analysis of these texts, even though they're so important in the fields of law, because they're about what is and isn't legal in the use of geopolitical violence. So there's lots of reasons to look at this data set, and I have days of feeling a little bit overwhelmed by how much there is to look at. So some of the things that I'm interested in is understanding what this register is doing in terms of the construction of ideas around organised violence, so the kinds of concepts of organised violence, what's being constructed or amplified in this data set, and also the kinds of categories of persons associated with organised violence. So what kinds of categories, how are they defined? So these kinds of questions, but there's really so much, the data is really very rich. And it extends the work that I published in this book, War and Its Ideologies, which was looking at, as I mentioned before, looking at the 2003 invasion of Iraq and the media reporting of that. And in my book, I combine corpus methods with standard grammatical analysis from a Hallidane point of view. You can see I've also got the cover of a book there called The Sociology of War and Violence. And as well as combining methods from SFL and corpus linguistics, I'm very interested in exploring how our linguistics can speak to other disciplines like sociology and critical legal studies. Human rights in the 20th century, at the same time that more people were killed in the 20th century alone than in the rest of human history combined. So we've got this ontological dissonance that has to somehow be resolved. And he argues that ideology has become more and more important. So the era that we live in is more and more ideologised. Okay, so let's now look at the relationship of SFL and corpus linguistics. And again, it's a field with a lot of really interesting work going on. Here's a book that was published in 2006 called System and Corpus, with a range of really interesting papers about the relationship between SFL and corpus linguistics. The editors make the following points about these fields. So SFL is essentially a theory of language. Corpus linguistics is essentially a method for investigating language. SFL is theory heavy, descriptions of fractal and thick. So we have a very elaborate grammatical descriptions that are metafunctionally organised, that are organised by rank, And, you know, that's quite off-putting for some people outside of SFL. Corpora has been used in SFL to test rather than to drive the theoretical description. Corpus linguistics, on the other hand, is almost perversely theory light and leads to thin descriptions. Corpus users can in fact belong to almost any school of linguistic thought. Although many corpus linguists seek to articulate the ways in which language behaviour reinforces social behaviour, no single theory of society is presupposed. Okay, so we're kind of coming to language on the one hand from a very theoretically outlined framework, corpus linguistics coming from a very strong empirical base. And again, as I said, lots of literature in this field. That's just a few papers, but there's a lot more. And I apologise, I'm sure there's a lot of interesting work going on in Brazil that I haven't caught up with, that's also combining corpus linguistics and SFL. And if you've got some work I should read, please do send it to me. Now, in that book that I mentioned, Matheson argues that corpus-based methodology and text-based research have played a central role in systemic functional linguistics since the beginning. In fact, before this framework began to be called systemic functional, text-based research in general and corpus-based methodology in particular were key concerns throughout. They were not grafted on later as an afterthought. And a new book that came out last year from two corpus linguists at Lancaster University, Brezhnev and McHenry. I've noticed that in this new book, I haven't been able to access it, so I don't know what they say on this topic, but you can see they are starting to look at SFL as one of the fields that can inform corpus linguistics. So the fields are kind of getting a bit closer together. Of course, the two fields have common origins in the work of Firth. So I've got a little quote here from a 1957 publication. And Firth says every scientific discipline must necessarily develop a special language adapted to its nature. Such technical words in linguistic theory include the expressions level or levels of analysis, context of situation, collocation and extended collocation, colligation, structure, system, element, unit, prosody, and prosodies, to name a few of the pivotal terms. And you can see in that spread of technicality some of the concepts that systemic linguists hold very close to our heart, at the same time that concepts like collocation and colligation have been fundamental in corpus linguistics. Firth also makes this beautiful point about collocation, where he says the collocation of a word or a piece is not to be regarded as mere juxtaposition. It is an order of mutual expectancy. The words are mutually expectant and mutually prehended. And of course, Firth gives to SFL a strong conception of the language in context, of context as a unit of analysis, and the idea that context is textured right into the patterns of wording, so that a particular word has deep associations with the words that go around it. And Hassan gave us a version of this principle. So she once said in an interview, I have an idea that there is a continuity from the living of life on the one hand, right down to the morpheme. And this, I think, encapsulates the way in which we can get a beautiful coming together of corpus linguistics and SFL. So corpus linguistics is very, very good at retrieving lexis, of looking at lexis in its local context and trying to work with that to work up the scale to understand these kinds of patterns in a broader social and cultural context. And this is where SFL can really add a lot of value to corpus linguistics. In my workshop on Monday and Tuesday night of this week, we had a little discussion of this diagram from a paper by Hassan that is, as far as I'm aware, the best representation of how we get from text right here down at the bottom of my screen up through the metafunctionally organised language and context to the production of what she calls the semantic variety, which is a kind of ideological perspective. And then when we cross over our line, that line in the middle, we're up into the context of culture, where we need to bring in ideas from sociology, legal studies, political science, history, to try and understand that bigger cultural context that our data belongs to. So Hassan gives us a really interesting way of looking at how we work on these different scales. And so in my research, I've been looking at the lexical item war in text in various registers with a view to trying to understand the ideologies that we build around this concept that are in the service of very powerful institutions, industries, and so on in our nation states. Okay, I'm going to jump over into the data now. So you can see I've got a standard corpus linguistics interface now that we're looking at, where I've simply searched the use of the word war in this data set. So we can see some of the concordance lines there and phrases like in time of war, contraband of war, in time of war, in time of war. So there's a lot of that. The laws and usages of war, the law of war, etc. Okay, so the beautiful power of a corpus program is it can go and find me all these examples and start to bring me in closer to these local environments where this really key term is being used. Okay, now the system automatically gives me a little summary up the top of my screen. So the system returned 1,403 matches across 80 different texts, and then it tells me the size of the corpus in words, 391,000, and I've got 110 texts in total. It then also gives me a measure that we know as normalised frequency. So 1,403 is the raw frequency, but 3,580 is the normalised frequency calculated per million words. And of course, that allows me to compare the frequency of this lexical item with the frequency in other data sets. And I've been looking around at various data sets for a comparison. Now, I've just got a few samples here. I've got so many things going on, and I've just tried to select a few so that I don't give a talk that's got too much detail and goes on for too long. Okay, so the first entry in that table is a data set called the Early English Books Online. So it's 1.2 billion words from 1475, which is the first published book in English, up to 1700. And so at that stage, the frequency of war in that data set is 202 words per million, and it ranks at 314 in that data set. So it's in the top 500 most frequent words of the early English books online. And when you look at the history of that period, it's not surprising. It's a period of so much going on in terms of the technology of war, the organisation of armies. There's a huge increase in the size of the armies of nation states over this period, and there's a whole lot of new lexis and expressions coming into English around the term war. And in fact, 44% of the texts in that data set have the word war. Okay, so going back to that period, we can see reasonable frequency, quite high in popularity, and coming up in a lot of texts. In my Laws of War corpus, so it's called the Macquarie Laws of War corpus, MQLWC, much more frequent, right? That's kind of not so surprising. It ranks at number 32. It turns up in 72% of the texts. And then just a quick note from the General Services List corpus. So this is in a publication, again, out of Lancaster, where there's a lot of corpus work going on. It's a corpus of 12 billion words of English from the 1960s up to the 2010s, where, again, we get this information that war is a highly frequent word. So it turns up in this corpus in the top 500 most frequent words. And I note that all of these rankings include closed system items. Okay, so they include the, of, to, in, etc. So these very, very frequent grammatical items are on this list, and war is still making it into the top 500 words. Okay, so already we see war is a very high frequency word, and it's a fairly highly dispersed word. So we're seeing it in lots and lots of contexts. Okay, now something I discovered when I was previously working on the media reporting of war, and this was a discovery that I could only do using a corpus linguistics program, is that where you find the word war, you don't find the word violence. So even though war is characterised by violence, that's what makes us able to call something war. Across all of the registers I've looked at, these two words do not collocate. Okay, so that's telling us something very interesting about the meanings that are circulating around the word war, that are enabling it to be something that has this really strong kind of cultural power, and that has a lot of legitimacy, and is associated with some really deep kind of cultural themes, including, as I mentioned before, some of our deep ideas around a viable masculinity. So this set of collocations, this little snap on my slide, this is from the laws of war. So we find the word violence in the laws of war, but it doesn't collocate with the word war. And I looked this up because, as I say, this is what I discovered looking at war and violence in the reporting of a specific war, which was a very violent war. There was lots of violence. There were thousands of civilians killed. And I collected media data from lots and lots of different sources, and it was almost impossible to find these words together. There are a couple of sources where they came together, but only if I really lowered the parameters for my collocational search. So fundamentally, these are two words that certainly in English we like very much to keep apart. Now, I mentioned that this data set that I've put together can be downloaded to use in desktop software programs. So the visualisation on your screen is from a program called Lanxbox. Also comes out of Lancaster, and it does lots of fantastic things. It's an absolutely beautiful piece of software. And one of the things it does is allow you to visualise the collocations around a key lexical node, and it can even show you. So I've got two nodes here, war up the top and violence down the bottom. And you can see that they're at a distance from each other because they don't go together in the laws of war. Okay, so what does war go with? So here's a list of the top 15 engrams for war. So of course we're looking at the meanings that are circulating around this lexical item, because we know the meaning of a word is not in the word. This is a function of the arbitrariness of the sign. And so a word like war that's so frequent, very dispersed, is accumulating meanings as it moves around doing all of the busy work that it does. So what do we find? We find prisoners of war, we find time of war, custom of war, remnants of war, laws of war, state of war, law of war, etc. Okay, so we've got a small set of fairly dominant concepts, and maybe you can see how many of these have war as a post-modifier. So, of course, the structure of prisoner of war is prisoner is the head of the nominal group, and of war is the post-modifier. Time of war the same, custom of war, laws of war. And the other examples in this list, we see war in a circumstantial location, so the use in war or in a war. Okay, so what's going on there? And in fact, it turns out over my whole data set that the use of this lexical item, 97% of all of the instances of it in this data set follow three grammatical locations. Okay, so either as a post-modifier, as in prisoners of war, in a circumstance during a war, and as a classifier. Okay, now this is interesting grammatically because the centre of a clause is the verbal group, right? And war is not in the verbal group. It used to be, but in the evolution of the ways we talk about war, it no longer is verbal. It's become a thing, and it's getting more and more de-centred in the clause, okay? So even though these are the laws of war, they're not very much about, war doesn't have a central grammatical place in this discourse. And so, like, what is going on there? It's, as I say, it's a kind of decentering, as if war is something is completely given, doesn't need to be defined, doesn't need to be discussed, doesn't have a central grammatical role across this 170 years, all of these different texts that are supposedly about the limits, putting the limits of war. Okay, now I've just pulled a few patterns out as I'm starting to work around what kinds of meanings are being built up around this lexical item. So just a few things, and I've got a lot more work to do, but you can see a little summary there. Okay, highly frequent and therefore naturalised. This concept is everywhere in our discourse. It's kept separated from violence. Violence has a different kind of function. And as I say, war is overwhelmingly decentered in the grammar of the clause. There's one single instance of war as agent in all of this discourse, and it's in an embedded clause. So yet again, a kind of, almost getting war in a central place to be looked at, but again, decentered by being put into an embedded clause. And of course, we could also look at the kinds of things going on in these collocations that are also very much about the naturalising of war. So the concept of a time of war it's like, it's almost like a season. It's so natural it just has its own time. Or a custom of war, as if war is just a traditional kind of thing that comes with its own customs. We have a notion of the laws of war actually right in the early documents from this period, as if there was already a laws of war before we even started to make laws of war. So again, lots of very interesting things in this data that I'm still working on, and I've done some standard SFL grammatical analysis of some of this data, but there's not really time for me to talk about that today, other than to say that these kinds of methods of analysis can certainly come together. Okay, so the last thing I want to just briefly mention before I wind up is how do we think about the kind of patterning that's going on, and how do we try and reason about what we're looking at and what other kind of analysis we need to do. So in corpus linguistics, there's various concepts about the kind of the semantics that get built up around a lexical item or a lexical pattern. So some of these terms are semantic prosody, semantic association, lexical priming. There's various literature on these topics. Now, SFL brings a bigger concept to this idea. And again, I'm referencing the work of Hassan, a paper called The World in Words. Hassan wrote a few papers that were very much about the notion of ideology and the ontogenesis of ideology. So how do people come to have the ideological positions that they have? She talked about the concept of a formative motif, drawing on the notion of configurative rapport from Woolf. So she's talking about the idea of a cluster of semantic features which are related to each other by a logic that underlies their configurative rapport. Such clusters are made up of meanings that are held together by logical necessity, each cluster being built around one strong lexical node, which bears some contextual presupposition giving rise to a set of implications. So thinking about the word war as one of these strong lexical nodes, it's pulling in meanings that have a kind of affinity around it, at the same time that it's clearly keeping its distance from the very negative meanings that go around the node violence. Okay, so we get a really nice concept here of a semantic cluster, things being held together semantically through a kind of logical necessity, and that bringing with it a contextual presupposition. And she goes on and says the occurrence of the cluster is typically prosodic. Okay, so it means it's not simply a matter of doing your standard SFL analysis. And I know from teaching and from having PhD students, it can be frustrating. You do your standard analysis and then you're like, where do I go now? And Hassan's saying to us, what we're looking for is something that's prosodic. The features of a cluster cannot be found in the same or even contiguous messages. The elements of the cluster are dispersed throughout the discourse. They have no syntagmatic order. These characteristics of the semantic cluster have important consequences. The prosodic realisation of the clusters makes them invisible. And of course, this is very important for ideology to have power. It needs to be invisible and therefore to feel like it's not an ideology, it's just the way things are. So SFL brings a richer concept of how we manage the kind of semantics of the patterns that we're looking for when we're going in search of a kind of ideological formation. So in summary, I want to argue for closer links between SFL and corpus linguistics, lots and lots of overlaps and harmonies, microgrammatical patterns where we go looking for the expression of ideologies, needs analysis from both ends, from the grammar and from attention to lexical choice, and bringing the two fields together will result in analysis that has a stronger empirical grounding and a more robust theoretical framework. Thank you. That's all from me. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Annabelle, for your presentation. Estamos abertos para perguntas, comentários. Quem quiser fazer, é só levantar a mão, que a Carol leva o microfone para vocês. Não?
Hi, Annabelle. Can you see me on the camera?
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I think it was very, very enlightening, a very beautiful project. Congratulations for that. I have two questions, actually. One is a more technical one. By your slides, we could infer that the corpus is available online in a platform with some features. So I'm very much interested to know which features are available there, which sort of searches can we do, and see if the corpus has any sort of notation. I could infer it's lemmatized by your talk, but is anything else before lemmatization or steaming or something like that? And the second question is about the network graph that you beautifully showed it to us. And I was very much impressed not only by the distance that the two words have, war and violence, but the very thin connections they do. I mean, very fragile connections in terms of network. So I would like you to comment on these two topics if possible.
Thank you for the questions. So the Sydney Corpus Lab, if you Google that, you'll find you can set up an account and access the data there. So it's based on the CQP web software, which is the same software that's used for the British National Corpus. So you can do search for concordance lines, you can search for collocations, and there's you can adjust the parameters for the collocational search, so you can set the window, you can set a minimum number of collocations, you can adjust the collocation or the association measure, so you can use frequency or mutual information or log likelihood, and there's other measures available as well. You can generate frequency lists, and you can do it also implements the semantic tagging system developed at Lancaster. I've forgotten precisely the name of it. So there's a few features there. So it's quite a very useful interface. So I'll just put that diagram back up that you referred to. So LancsBox is freely available to download, and it's pretty simple to use. I could teach myself to use it, and I'm not very computational. So the diagram represents the stronger collocates by distance. So you can see some of these little circles are closer to the lexical node than others. And in this case, it shows me the shared collocates between these two words, but then violence doesn't collocate. So the collocates of violence are sexual, gender, sporadic, isolated. Okay, so violence is not really about the violence of war. It's something that's seen as kind of outside the laws of war. So it's got a kind of minor function in this discourse. In the media discourse that I was looking at, violence was related to anti-war protests. So it wasn't related to the violence of the invasion of Iraq. It was related to the reporting of people protesting against the war. And the capacity to visualise is just, it's fantastic. Really helps you see what's going on with a particular item.
Yeah, because those results are very interesting, because if you don't characterize war as a violence, but peace protests as violence. So in a certain way, you've got a sort of, to my mind, it's sort of change the discourse around and blaming the violence into the pacifist is not the war itself. So that's astonishing to say the least.
Absolutely, and I didn't notice that. I'd spent a lot of time with the data. I needed a machine to tell me that was the case. I hadn't figured that out for myself.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, Annabelle. My question is related to Rodrigo's, because I wanted to ask you about violence, because we saw that war and violence rarely, if they do collocate, but war collocates with war crimes, prisoners of war, alleviate the sufferings. So, we can see that there's a violent tone underlining all of these collocations. And I wanted to know your opinion on why this happens. Not violence, but all of those violent associations.
Yeah. So prisoners of war well predates the data that I'm looking at. So it's a term that emerges at the beginning of the 17th century. And so it's a deep preoccupation in this data. And I mentioned that this data, it does a range of things, and one of the things is that it creates or amplifies certain categories. And so there's an obsession, if you like, with the prisoner of war in this data set. When you go looking for a category like civilian, so the concept of civilian is created in international law. So it has a definition, and in fact, it starts to come up around the end of World War II. And then in one of the 1977 texts, you get a definition of civilian, and civilian is not military, right? So you get a negative definition of the concept of civilian. So it has to emerge over time, whereas prisoners of war, there's a preoccupation with this category. So it's part of what's actually driving the origins of international war law. After World War II, there's quite a lot of energy in this area towards criminalising or developing this concept of war crimes and crimes against humanity. So you can have a war crime, but war itself is not a crime. Okay, so a war crime is a certain kind of behaviour that apparently doesn't fit within the rules of war. And so it's part of the later period of this data, coming up to the establishment of the International Criminal Court at the beginning of the 21st century. This is where the international community prosecutes war crimes. And it's a really amazing document because it tries to define crimes of violence in a context that's really all about violence. So the grammar of war crimes is a topic for another day, but it's a very interesting linguistic manoeuvre of how you legalise a whole lot of things in war at the same time that you've got to try and find the space for the things that you treat as a crime and as not within the laws of war. But it's still distinct despite that, despite war crimes. War and violence are still distinct elements in this data set and elsewhere.
Okay, thank you. So I've got one more question. You were talking about how these ontological dissonance between the humanitarian discourse and, you know, how we have legalized war, and I was wondering if these two discourses were produced by the same people or in the same time, because, for example, we can have laws that condemned, not exactly war, because you said it's legalized, but the outcomes of war, but at the same time, we were talking in the workshop, there are a lot of movies and video games that glorify it. So maybe these are two different discourses that conflict because there are separate interests around it.
Thanks for that beautiful question. One of the things I mentioned in my workshop was that Halliday directly references Gramsci's concept of ideology, where he says it's not one monolithic thing. It can be a whole set of kind of contradictory ideas. And this is really very apparent in some of these texts in particular, where there's all of this kind of anxiety to stop the violence of war. They don't call it the violence of war because those words don't go together, but there's this recognition about, you know, all these terrible things about war at the same time that these texts very, very clearly allow for the use of lethal, brutal technology. And so these texts are a site for this almost schizophrenic presentation of a striving for peace at the same time that nation states are entitled to the use of violence. And the limits on violence are very few. So there's a few things the international community's agreed on: a prohibition on chemical weapons, a prohibition on biological weapons, but we actually can't get sufficient agreement on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So you can see these tensions around wanting to reject the use of violence at the same time that these laws very clearly make there's so much scope for legal violence in war in the laws of war.
Okay, thank you.
Obrigado. Thank you, Annabelle. Bom, agora a gente vai fazer um breve intervalo e seguimos depois para a programação de comunicações orais e painéis. Queria só dar uma informação de uma alteração nessa programação de comunicações orais. O trabalho Discurso de ódio em mídias sociais como estratégia de persuasão popular, da Karen Mercury, ele seria apresentado agora pela manhã, às 11h15 da manhã, foi transferido para a tarde, às 3h40, no mini auditório. Então, caso alguém tenha interesse em assistir, prestigiar esse trabalho, vai ser à tarde, não agora pela manhã. Todas as outras apresentações estão confirmadas, seguem o cronograma inicial. Ok? Depois das sessões, né, de comunicações orais e painéis, teremos a pausa para o almoço e voltamos aqui para este auditório às 1h30 da tarde para a palestra da Elaine Espíndola. Então, bom dia para vocês e até daqui a pouco.
Annabelle, thank you very much for coming. And
Thank you.
I'll make your slides
I'm
available.
going to have a beer now.
Okay, I'll make your slides available when we send the link to the all participants.
Terrific.
Okay, thank you
Okay,
very much
thanks
one
so
more
much.
time.
Bye-bye.
Os slides da professora Annabelle estarão disponíveis depois na lista dos participantes, tá? A gente vai só colocá-los num link público, tá? Obrigado.
E o aviso chato que eu estou falando todos os dias, credenciamento. O credenciamento ainda está funcionando lá perto do auditório e também teremos um plantão na hora do almoço. Estou falando isso porque tem 40 pessoas que ainda não se credenciaram. Algumas não vieram, mas outras que a gente já viu, mas a gente não deu baixa lá. E sem o credenciamento, sem o crachá, vocês não conseguem ter acesso ao certificado, enfim, todas essas questões burocráticas, além das logísticas que a gente comenta aqui. Tá bom? Então, não deixem de fazer o credenciamento e falar com quem vocês conheçam, que teremos um plantão hoje, na hora do almoço, de 12h à 1h da tarde, e depois não teremos mais. Obrigado.